We're back talking about a double homicide that happened more than 40 years ago. And now a reporter turned podcaster works to clear a man's name. And the podcast, Murder, Etc., which launched earlier this year, is really starting to gain a lot of traction. And tonight, we're hearing from the creator himself of this podcast.
Fox Carolina's Brookley Cromer is live outside the police department. So, Brookley, why did this reporter start Murder, Etc.?
Well, this all started nearly 20 years ago when Brad Willis was a reporter assigned to a story about a man who was on death row and then convicted of killing a cop, and he was eventually granted parole. Now, he says this is something that shocked him, is something that he had never heard about before. But then once he started digging into some of the evidence, he says he believes that this man could have been innocent all along. There are defining moments in every journalist's career. For Brad Willis, the year was 2001.
The story that Greenville believes is true isn't as true as they think it is.
Willis was a reporter working in Greenville when he first covered a case that still haunts him to this day. And nearly 2 decades later, he's still searching for the truth. The story about a convicted cop killer who was granted parole.
I asked myself, when was the last time someone who had been convicted of killing a cop got parole in South Carolina? It just doesn't happen.
He says the story caused a public outcry, and the man's parole was eventually overturned, sending him back to prison for nearly a decade.
When I finished this story, I thought, I've done a really good job right here. It was only later that I realized that I hadn't studied the case hard enough, and as a result, I hadn't told the whole story.
Now he hopes to find answers to the questions that still linger and clear a man's name who was convicted of murder more than 40 years ago.
Even though that's now 18 years after that initial story I did, I feel like that it's still my job as a reporter to tell this story the right way.
But the story began many years before it made headlines around the state in the 2000s. It all started 44 years ago in 1975. Willis says Frank Looper was Greenville's top narcotics cop at the time and about to break the biggest case of his career when he and his father were shot, execution style, inside the family's garage.
Drug cop Lieutenant Frank Looper knew too much. Police eventually decided that it had nothing to do with his job, that it was a random robbery.
Charles Wakefield Jr. was sent to death row, but Willis believes the wrong man was convicted. He says Wakefield had solid alibis and could account for his whereabouts the day of the murders. The podcast Murder, Etc. looks into other theories and uncovers evidence that he says points to corruption, ties to the Dixie Mafia, and the possibility the murders were a hit.
The story is bigger than the murder. The story is bigger than what happened at the Looper garage, and it's bigger than Charles Wakefield. And that's why the etc. is almost more important than the murder.
Now, Wakefield escaped the death penalty after a Supreme Court ruling, but he did end up spending 35 years behind bars until he was granted parole in 2010. Now, he still maintains his innocence to this day and says he hopes to one day clear his name. Cody and Diana.
So, Brookley, how can people listen to this podcast and to learn more about this case?
Well, the next episode comes out on April 30th, but in the meantime, people can catch up on the other 7 episodes wherever you listen to podcasts. And we also have a link to that at foxcarolina.com. Live in Greenville, Brookley Cromer, Fox Carolina, the 10 o'clock news.